Curly explains that what happens is we come up with a pure idea in the ace, and that we watch that idea sort of degrade as it goes down through the tree. And you would say that the negative sort of sequences here tend to be the 5 and the 7, because the 5 is the point at which essentially the first 3 represents the top triad, where the idea is unfolding, as it were. In the 4, it establishes itself below the abyss in a material sort of sense, and that's usually when it starts to fall apart, which is why the 5, the sort of breaking up of that solid object of the 4 is what follows that. In the 6, it sort of reharmonizes. In the 7, it starts to degrade again, because harmony can only last for a certain amount of time. And then in the 8, it kind of balances that second degradation. In the 9, it kind of reestablishes itself, and in the 10, it sort of finishes. And the reason, for example, something like oppression is such a negative sounding word for the realization of the wand suit, but the thing is about the wands, it's fire energy, it's pure energy. It doesn't like to be solid and manifested in that kind of way. In a way, it restrains the nature of fire, to put it in that respect.
It's like a film script thing. That's exactly a formula for a film script.
Oh yeah, no, it's a story. It's a story. This oppression realizes itself in the cup suit. So what Curly wants us to say is essentially the 10 or final point of one tree is almost identical to the 1 or Keter point on the second tree that it flows into. So this what do I want to call it? This manifestation of the will, the energy of fire, realizes itself in love, which becomes abundance, which turns into luxury, which becomes disappointment, which turns into pleasure, which becomes debauch, which turns into indolence, and then becomes happiness and realizes itself in satiety. And the cup suit is interesting in that respect, because you're really looking at, it is the water element, it's emotional energy, and emotions are kind of one of those things that you can only indulge to a certain extent before they become meaningless. Like, all pleasure becomes meaningless after a certain amount of time if it becomes habitual, if it becomes routine, and it's the human animal is interested in new things, and we can get accustomed to anything. We could have the most magnificent, wonderful lives, but if we're living that wonderful, luxurious life 7 days a week, we're just going to get bored of it. Everyone will. Everyone needs new things and new stimulation and challenges, and that, I think, is what the explanation of the cup suit really has a lot to do with that. Water energy, for example, we see, and once again, it's like, really, the water energy comes more to a degradation in the 4 than I think a lot of them, because the luxury card, certainly in my experience, has been always a bad sign. It's almost a sign of complacency. Earlier on, it's more unified, happier, but that's the point at which someone is starting to get used to those things, which is why the 5 is the disappointment card, where it comes out to something that's just terrible. And more in the lower triad, it's also true that the cards are more negative in the cup suit, like debauch and indolence. Indolence is like, I love Crowley's explanation of it. He says it's like the morning after, but there was no night before. So, and that, I think, is an excellent way of summing that up. But the reason that transfers into happiness is, after a certain amount of time, you can only be so miserable. We get used to misery too. We can become accustomed to all these things. And then all of a sudden you're taking pleasure in very small things that you wouldn't even find interesting in your normal state of mind, but because you've been through something miserable, you're getting real, unique pleasure out of these things. Like, if you haven't had a good cup of coffee in 2 weeks because you're broke out of your mind and you can't afford it, that cup of coffee is going to be amazing when you can finally have it. It's going to be just amazing. And if you're drinking that amazing coffee every day, you're not going to appreciate it at all. No.
That's the reason for Starbucks.
So this culminates in satiety, which is emotional fulfillment or emotional satisfaction, to the point at which that you're really just not interested in going further with that, which is why it transfers into the swords suit, which is sort of your intellectual ideas. The air element, the element of air is about thinking, and that's why it's associated with the sword. We come back to the idea of limiting things, defining things, putting things into categories, and that's really where that belongs. And that's why the first card, once we get past the ace, I'll talk about the aces when we're done, because they're annoying, is called Peace Restored. And restored is parenthetical. It's peace on the card, but it's actually the restoration of peace, because this is when the intellect starts to step in. You know, our will has gone through its cycle, our emotions have gone through its cycle, we've been through both these things, we feel like maybe we even understand both of these almost not opposing factors necessarily, but they're two different categories of being. And when the intellect steps in, it's stepping in to set things right, which is why it's followed by the sorrow card, and which is followed by truce, which is followed by defeat, which is followed by science, which is followed by futility, which is followed by interference, which turns into cruelty, and culminates in ruin. Which I think is some of Crowley's anti-rationalism coming in. He definitely he sees the intellect as a useful tool, but not an ultimate goal. And again, as we see in both the emotion and intellect sections, the water and the air, there's a lot of negative stuff that happens in here. I mean, there's nothing fun about futility. There's nothing great about defeat. But then again, we have to experience these things. Crowley called defeat the spice of victory. So it's like, if you do not periodically push yourself up against something and fail to accomplish it, you are probably not challenging yourself at all. And if we challenge ourselves and really try to reach for the highest point that we can accomplish, then we will be defeated from time to time. That's just a given. The culmination of this suit, which is ruin, is actually one of the more beneficial cards in the area. Crowley says it's a time for reorganization. The intellect has been through its thing. It's run its gauntlet. It's tried to organize everything and put everything together and limit everything and define everything and put everything into its right box. And it ultimately couldn't do that, but at the same time, going through that experience and making that attempt gives it an opportunity to reorganize its priorities, to re-examine itself.
Sort of like the death card being a symbol of rebirth and new growth.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, the death card is really a negative sign. It's dramatic, but at the same time, it's not. This ruin culminates then in the disc suit, which begins with the card which Crowley called harmonious change. So this is the point at which we really become capable of making real, lasting changes, but not just changes, but changes that are in harmony with everything that has been learned and realized in the manifestation of the other three suits. This is followed by work, which is followed by power, which is followed by worry, which is followed by success, which is followed by failure, which is followed by prudence, which is followed by gain, which is followed by wealth. And Crowley tells us that the wealth card necessarily translates into the Ace of Wands and reinvents the cycle. The disc suit is a little nicer, I think, than the others, just like the wand suit is a little bit nicer. Like the bookends are kind of the nicer suits, really. But the disc suit is all about your practical stuff, you're getting stuff done, and I think that's why we see images like worry and failure and prudence. Like prudence, whenever I think of the prudence card, I think of what I call the 40 bucks rule, which is that the 40 bucks is the worst amount of money you could possibly have, because it's just enough to get something nice, but not enough to get something really, and really you're going to regret how you spend that money, however you spent it, because you've been thinking how else you could have spent it. Whereas if you have like 20 bucks, you're just happy to have whatever you can have, and if you have 100 bucks, well shit, you're set. And that's my analogy.
So what are the discs associated with, if it's will, emotions, and intellect, the first three?
Materialization, like the material world. And that's why, like Crowley says that the wealth card is in a sense a pendant for the entire minor arcana, the entire system. And
it's sort of based on the more Kabbalistic worlds as well.
that's right.
There's also earth, I see. Right.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And you know, I think that the history of the tarot is really bad. There's very little reliable scholarship on where it comes from or anything like that. And I don't really take to the people who insist that it's completely ancient and whatever. There's no